In this episode, I'll take an in-depth look at the key witness in the Jack the Ripper murder series. If you want to properly understand this case, it's important to get a secure grip on the details, which goes way beyond the superficial popular history nonsense that you see in most documentaries and videos. And it is vital that we understand what this witness said he saw and heard when he had an interaction with a man who was almost certainly the individual known to history as Jack the Ripper. The night, or rather early morning in question, was the 31st of August 1888, when Mary Ann or Polly Nichols died at the hands of that killer. The location was Whitechapel. The witness we'll study was called Robert Paul, and the man he interacted with called himself Charles Cross, but his real name was Charles Lechmere. Just before 3:45 in the morning of the 31st of August 1888, Robert Paul left his house at Foster Street on his way to work as a carman, a cart delivery driver. It must have been quite dark and the back streets were almost deserted. His house was over there, just inside what is now Sainsbury's, behind that wall. The timings given during this period attract some controversy. Some claim that no relevance can be placed on any of the timings given, but time was not a vague concept in 1888. From 1832 onwards, there was a daily time check initiated from the Greenwich Royal Observatory on top of a hill that was easily visible in Greenwich Park. You can see it behind me now, from which there was a time ball that was dropped at 1 p.m. every day. And it's still the case. I can even see, with my eyes here, I can even see the time ball now. Ships in the Thames could observe this and mark their time. From 1852, a telegraphic signal was sent instantaneously from the observatory to master clocks in central London and all major cities around the country. The railway companies sent further telegraphic signals to their stations in their networks because it was very essential that their timetables were strictly kept to. And that's one of the main reasons why this whole process was put in place. Through observation of the actual drop of that ball, of the master clocks and all the station clocks around the country, neighbouring clocks were changed, if necessary, in succession, one after the other. Any adjustments would be made by the clock keeper. As I said, by eyesight, one clock would change, one clock would change, one clock would change. And that is how time was kept across the country. Obviously, sometimes you get a slovenly clock keeper who'd be less vigilant than others, but that would be the exception and not the rule. Now, Whitechapel, which is in this direction, was about 5 miles from the Greenwich Royal Observatory. When Paul left home, his house was just over there, staring right in the face would have been the clock on the Man, Crossman and Paulin Albion Brewery. This clock would have been used to mark the shift changes at that huge brewery, and it's unlikely that it had been out to any appreciable degree. The current clock has only one face, but only dates from remodelling works that took place after 1894, when it replaced an earlier one that had a face that pointed in this direction. We also know that the brewery was illuminated down there to deter theft, and there was a wall beyond that fence. There was a wall that was illuminated and protected the brewery. It was about 35 yards from Robert Paul's house at number 30 Foster Street to Bath Street, which ran across the bottom. Paul must have walked down to Bath Street and turned right in this direction. Paul walked 55 yards down Bath Street and then turned left onto Brady Street. On his left hand side along here would have been that illuminated boundary wall of the Albion Brewery. So Paul would have crossed Brady Street from Bath Street in order to turn up Durwood Street, which was Bucks Row. And over on his left, he could still see the clock tower on the top of the Albion Brewery. Where that fence is along there, that was the illuminated wall of the brewery at the time. Paul claimed he entered Bucks Row at exactly 3:45 a.m, which makes sense and agrees with his earlier timing, although I've seen it claimed by some people that his timings didn't agree, but clearly they do. On entering Bucks Row, Paul walked westwards on the northern pavement, and at some point he saw in the darkness ahead of him a man standing in the road. Paul initially said, "I saw a man standing where the woman was." But when Paul eventually appeared at the inquest on the 17th of September, he slightly amended this to, he saw in Bucks Row a man standing in the middle of the road, just over here. Paul carried on towards him, but the man approached him. Paul swerved to avoid him because this area was, as far as Paul was concerned, was a hot spot for mugging and for people being attacked in the street. And that's what he thought was going to happen to him. This man turned out to be another carman called Charles Lechmere, although, as I've said, he kept that name from the authorities during this case and instead used the name Charles Cross. But neither name was known to Paul. Before we go into exactly what happened next, I'll repack what I've already told you. Whether Paul saw Lechmere standing slap bang in the middle of the road or a couple of paces away next to the brown stable yard where Polly lay is of no criminological significance because it's literally a couple of paces. Bucks Row, as you can see, is and was an extremely narrow thoroughfare. A couple of steps would have put Lechmere right next to the body or in the middle of the road. When Paul saw Lechmere, Lechmere was standing extremely close to the body. In Lechmere's account, Paul was 30 or 40 yards away when he first noticed him, and by Paul's account it must have been about the same distance. As Lechmere lived at Doveton Street, a little way to the east of Foster Street, if he had left home before Paul and had innocently walked any of the logical routes to Bucks Row, he would have passed down Bath Street across the end of Foster Street, then turned into Brady Street and onto Bucks Row. Robert Paul will have been following on behind him. As Lechmere estimated that Paul was about 30 to 40 yards behind, allowing for a little extra distance for Lechmere pausing as he saw the body, along the route Paul must have been walking perhaps 45 yards behind Lechmere. As Paul came out of his house on Foster Street, Lechmere should have been in sight and sound as he walked across Bath Street next to the illuminated wall of Albion Brewery. When Paul turned into Bath Street, he should have been able to see Lechmere in front of him again by the illuminated walls of Albion Brewery. As Paul turned into the darker and quieter Bucks Row, Lechmere would have been walking about 45 yards in front of him for a good 90 yards. Yet Paul didn't see or hear him. That is, of course, if Lechmere had been walking in front of him all that way. He only noticed Lechmere when he saw him stationary in the road up there next to the freshly slain corpse of Polly Nichols. Had Paul noticed Lechmere at any stage on that journey, it would clear Lechmere at a stroke, but he didn't. Furthermore, we know that slightly later on, PC Neal, standing at the murder scene, heard PC Thane walking on Brady Street, way down there, and it must have been the far side of Brady Street, as the near side was part of PC Neal's beat. That's a distance of 155 yards. He heard him, yet we're to believe that Robert Paul, despite being on the alert as he regarded Bucks Row as the haunt of gangs who might knock him down, had not heard Lechmere walking about 45 yards ahead of him. In fact, Paul didn't hear Lechmere at all. He saw him when he was standing still. But we'll continue. We'd got to the point where Lechmere walked towards Paul and Paul swerved around him. To get his attention, Lechmere then tapped Paul on the shoulder and said, "Come and look at this woman." It's sometimes claimed that had Lechmere not tapped Paul on the shoulder, Paul would have walked straight past the body. This is one of those nonsensical claims one finds in Ripperology, as when Lechmere approached Paul, Paul had yet to reach the body. Paul's reaction to walking past the body, had Lechmere not approached him, is totally unknown. Anyway, together they went up to the body. She was lying on her back with her legs slightly apart. Her dress was raised to her hips. Her hat was by her side, and they saw no blood. Polly's abdominal wounds were covered by her clothing, and it seems her throat wound had not bled profusely, at this stage anyway. There followed a curious episode where they both touched the body in various ways. In order to understand who touched the body where, you must read all the different accounts by all the reporters present at the inquest, as some got confused as to who touched Polly's body where and when. Lechmere touched her hands, which he said were cold, and her face, which he said was warm. Paul also touched her hand and face, which he found to be cold. Paul also touched her breast or heart and felt a slight breadth, such a one as might be felt in a child 2 or 3 months old. Paul thought she was alive and suggested they prop her up, but Lechmere refused, saying he didn't want to touch her, even though he had just touched her. Thinking Polly had perhaps fainted, Paul made an attempt to make her decent by pulling her dress down, but it got caught underneath and he could only pull it down as far as her knees. The lack of blood visible at this stage, in contrast to later when other witnesses arrived on the scene, tells us that Polly had only just been killed. It was light enough for Polly's hat to be visible and for Paul to realise that her dress was up to her waist. Furthermore, Paul felt what he thought was faint breathing, which was probably actually the last gasp of life leaving her body. This was confirmed by Dr. Llewellyn, who arrived at the scene about half an hour after Lechmere and Paul had been there, and he estimated that Polly had died about half an hour before. Llewellyn's timing is obviously not dependent upon the time o'clock. Claiming he had to be at work punctually, Paul said he had to leave, and Lechmere said likewise. They both left the body, an act of callousness in the opinion of the noted Ripper author Philip Sugden. Both claimed they would alert any policeman they saw. They walked off together in a westerly direction down Bucks Row, and immediately to their left and clearly visible on the top of the London Hospital was their clock. Just 50 yards further on from where poor Polly's body lay was the gate to the Great Eastern Railway Yard, and in there on the gate was a policeman, PC 81 of the Great Eastern Railway, a railway policeman. His duty was to guard that gate and stop trespassers. Perhaps he wasn't exactly at the gate when they went past, but how many times have they been past? Surely they would have known that he was there, that he was in that vicinity. But did they bother to raise the alarm with him? No, they did not. Philip Sugden was right. They were being very callous. They were not exactly urgently looking for the first available policeman. It should also be remembered that there was a beat policeman around here who passed by roughly every half hour. His name was to be known as PC Neil, and he must have been in one of these streets around here, and they again must have been aware that he was in the vicinity. But did they look to find him? No, they did not. And he must have come past soon afterwards, because after they left he went and rediscovered the body. But on they walked, turning right into Baker's Row now called Valence Road, and at the junction of Old Montague Street, Hanbury Street and Bakers Road, they bumped into PC Jonas Misen, who was a beat policeman with H Division of the Metropolitan Police, who was engaged in knocking up duty. PC Misen was acting as a human alarm clock to residents who had paid a fee to the local police station for that service. Robert Paul estimated that it had taken no more than 4 minutes to reach the inconvenient Misen from when he had reached the body with Charles Lechmere. Robert Paul was evidently quite clockwise. This was his fourth mention of time. In his newspaper interview, he said he left home at before 3:45. At the inquest, he stated that he arrived at Bucks Row at exactly 3:45. He was aware that he had to be on work on time, and that was his excuse for abandoning the body, indicating that he knew he had limited time to make the distance to his workplace. Robert Paul presumably had some sort of clock at home to enable him to wake up in time for work. He cannot have been knocked up by someone like PC Misen because, as we'll later see, the police had some trouble finding him. Paul also had two public clocks as points of reference at the Albion Brewery and at the London Hospital. It's curious that Lechmere set his time of departure at about 3:30 a.m, although two separate newspaper reports have him saying it was at 3:20. It would have taken him about 7 minutes to reach the crime scene at Brown Stable Yard at Bucks Road, and that would have put him there about 8 minutes before Paul arrived. Both had access to view the Albion Brewery and London Hospital clocks. Both claimed to be late for work, so they must have had a good idea of the time. Both had only set off from home a short time before, and so had less time to be detached from what the likely time was. Lechmere claimed he reached work at 4 a.m. Lechmere worked at Broad Street Railway Station, and as I indicated earlier, railway stations kept very strict time. There is compelling evidence that both Paul and Lechmere were very aware of the time, irrespective of the time estimates given by other separate police witnesses. The o'clock timings in this case are a cause of great controversy. In investigative terms, it doesn't have any significance whether or not Paul met Lechmere at 3:40 or 3:45. It doesn't matter whether or not Paul was 5 minutes out. Either way, the evidence shows that Polly had only just died when Paul met Lechmere. In the words of the coroner in his summing up, she was only just dead if life was really extinct. But in any case, if Lechmere was guilty, as I think he was, the time he gave, 3:30 or even 3:20, would not necessarily be accurate. People guilty of murder are unsurprisingly known to lie, even under oath. 3:30 would be far more likely to be the latest time he thought he could get away with saying. My personal opinion is that he would have left home nearer 3:15 or even earlier than that. But let's return to the interaction between PC Misen and the carman, which is another matter of controversy, because we have two, or arguably three, or even four, conflicting versions. I'll start with PC Misen's version. PC Misen said he was approached by a man who said, "You are wanted in Bucks Row by a policeman. A woman is lying there." This man was later identified as Charles Cross, but it's clear that at the time Misen didn't obtain his name. The likely reason why Misen didn't obtain his name was because he was claiming to be a messenger from another officer on a non-critical matter. If Misen's account is accurate, then Lechmere told him a deliberate lie. He was not wanted in Bucks Row by another policeman. Misen had to be reminded by the coroner that another man was with Cross, and one report suggests that the other man, who was in fact Paul, was already walking off down Hanbury Street. It seems clear that Paul's presence wasn't significant to Misen. Under cross-examination from the coroner, Misen admitted that he'd finished knocking on the door he was on before he went to Bucks Row. It must be remembered that the coroner would have had in front of him each witness's written statement, which allowed him to cross-examine the witness to gain clarity on one point or another, or to make sure that the witness covered all relevant matters for the benefit of the jury. In the case of PC Misen, this will have been the report he must have written when he returned to his police station after his beat, which will in turn have been based upon his notebook entries. In other words, Misen's testimony cannot have deviated significantly from what he wrote up on the very morning of the murder. When Misen arrived at the crime scene, he found PC Neal already there. As I said, in the meantime, PC Neal had rediscovered the body. While PC Misen assumed he'd been directed to the location by a messenger sent by PC Neal thought he'd attracted PC Misen's attention with his lamp. Clearly, no conversation took place between them which might have brought this discrepancy to light, and Misen was sent off almost immediately to get an ambulance, which is actually a handheld cart. PC Neal was from Bethnal Green's J Division of the Metropolitan Police, while PC Misen was from Whitechapel's H Division. By an unfortunate happenstance, the boundary between the two divisions was along Baker's Row. This obviously would not have assisted in clarifying matters. Now let's look at the second version of the interaction between the carman and PC Misen, that given by Charles Lechmere, who appeared at the inquest immediately after Misen, but who gave the name Charles Cross. Lechmere claimed he said to PC Misen, "There's a woman lying in Bucks Row. She looks to me as though she was dead or drunk," and that Paul added, "I believe she is dead." In this version, Lechmere led the conversation, stating that he wasn't sure whether the woman was alive or not, and Paul chipped in that he thought the woman was dead. There was no mention of another policeman. If this version was true, Misen was negligent, as he should have taken at least one of them back with him and should have taken their names. He also should have gone straight away and not continued with the last door knock he was on. Lechmere, by the way, confirmed he saw Misen continue to knock on a door. It's interesting that Lechmere claimed he was unsure whether or not the woman was dead, whereas he claimed Paul was sure she was dead. However, moments before, Lechmere had gone into some detail about how Paul had wanted to prop the body up and had felt a movement on her breast. It's clear that in fact Paul didn't think she was dead at all. Lechmere's testimony was in a muddle. Lastly, what did Robert Paul have to say about it? His accounts are the least straightforward. Notice I said accounts in the plural. The first version of Paul's story was based on a newspaper interview he gave to Lloyd's Weekly newspaper on the day of the murder, Friday, the 31st of August, which appeared in print on the 2nd of September, the day before Lechmere testified. In this account, Paul claimed he knew that the woman was clearly dead as she was so cold, and she must have been dead for some time. Paul also claimed he approached and spoke to PC Misen on his own and told him that there was a dead woman, but Misen virtually ignored him and continued knocking up. Paul's second version was given when he eventually testified at the inquest on Monday the 17th of September. Now, he admitted he felt a movement on the victim's breath, signifying that he thought she was alive. He also agreed that he didn't go up to PC Misen on his own, and actually didn't give any specifics as to the conversation that took place beyond a vague, they met a policeman at the corner of Old Montague Street and told him what they'd seen. Why did Paul give two very different accounts? Well, I'll come back to that question shortly. Thank you for watching so far. There's plenty more to come in this episode, but please remember to hit the subscribe button and comment. Anyway, on with the story. The inconsistencies or anomalies that I've so far covered were completely missed by the police and the press at the time, and by generations of so-called Ripperologists, until the Lechmere theory was developed. The only aspect which was picked up upon was Sugden, when he described the callous behaviour of Paul and Lechmere when they abandoned the body. But he's not without sin, as he described Lechmere as approaching Polly's body gingerly, which is an invention and is in none of the original sources, and carries with it the automatic implication of innocence. After the Misen interaction, Paul and Lechmere continued down Hanbury Street, walking past number 29, where just 8 days later Annie Chapman was to be murdered, and about 100 yards further on, Paul cut off into his workplace at Cobbett's Court, now called Cobbett's Place, and Lechmere continued on to his workplace for a haulage company called Pickford's at Broad Street Goods Station. Robert Paul seems to have delivered goods between his workplace and Covent Garden, probably in connection with the fruit and veg trade, as Cobbett's Court was just across the road from Spitalfield's fruit and vegetable market on Commercial Street, and Covent Garden also specialised in fruit and veg. On his way back from work on the day of the murder, Paul ran into a reporter from Lloyd's weekly newspaper, who was hanging around in Bucks Row, and gave him an interview. Lloyd's weekly newspaper was a Sunday paper with a very large circulation, and they sat on their story, their scoop, until that Sunday. The initial press reports were full of stories about how PC Neal had found the body, and indeed, when the inquest into Polly Nichols' death opened on Saturday the 1st of September, PC Neal was presented as the first finder. In 1888, for the vast majority of people, Saturday was a normal working day, and it was no different for Robert Paul. On his way home from work that day, for the second time, he bumped into a reporter here for Lloyd's weekly newspaper on Bucks Row, and repeated his story, emphasising that PC Neal wasn't the first finder. Paul, however, didn't tell this to the authorities. The next day was Sunday, the 2nd of September, and Lloyd's weekly newspaper duly published Paul's account, which was headlined "Remarkable Statement," along with his second rebuttal of PC Neal. The report provides an interesting insight into Robert Paul's character. It shows him to be egotistical. In his account, he dominated the proceedings and led the conversation with Misen. Lechmere wasn't even there, whereas Misen barely noticed Paul. He's critical of the police, as he was to be when he made a later interview, which I'll come on to. Paul seems to be one of those stereotypical EastEnders who is distrustful of the police, which is probably why he didn't involve himself too much with PC Misen, and why he failed to volunteer himself to the authorities, while being at the same time quite happy to brag to the press. Paul showed that he was easily influenced by the initial press reports. He claimed the body was stone cold and clearly had been there for a considerable time. Yet his actual opinion was that Polly was just about still alive. That is why Paul's remarkable statement has inaccuracies within it, and why it disagrees with his reluctant inquest testimony. The Lloyd's report was only one of several newspaper stories that were doing the rounds, second-guessing the police and running parallel investigations. One particularly stubborn story was that there was a trail of bloodstains back to Brady Street, and there were cries of murder, implying that Polly was attacked on Brady Street and chased down Bucks Row to where she met her fate. The police were adamant that this was not the case and had specifically checked for bloodstains and mentioned this at the inquest on the Saturday. It was not uncommon in the immediate aftermath of an alarming event for all sorts of inaccurate stories to circulate. In a heightened emotional state, recreated memories always proliferate. Lloyd's, which boasted they had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world, repeated the blood story and denied that PC Neal was the first finder. This clearly exasperated the police, and on that same Sunday evening, the 2nd of September, Inspector Helson, who was leading the investigation at J Division's Bethlehem Police Station, issued a statement to the press. He again debunked the Brady Street blood trail story and then went on to reinforce the police's contention that PC Neal and PC Neal alone was the first finder of the body. And the policemen at either end of the street, that is PC Thane and PC Misen, had seen no one to attract their attention. Misen, believing that the carmen were messengers sent by PC Neal, clearly did not regard them as being noteworthy. As far as the police were concerned, Paul's remarkable statement was just another piece of bunkum, another misleading press report. However, the next day, Monday the 3rd of September, all of this changed as Charles Lechmere presented himself to the inquest, probably actually to Commercial Street Police Station in the first instance, to give his side of the story. He was in his work clothes. He even appeared in the witness box clad in his carman's apron, as if to emphasise his working man persona. Interestingly, Charles Lechmere withheld his true name, the name he used in every other contact with any form of authority in his life, including in 1888, when he registered the birth of a child for the church, for the baptism of that child, for the school entries, for when he moved house for all of his children, because he only moved to Doveton Street that June, in Mile End Old Town Parish for his electoral registration, with his landlord for his rent because his electoral registration was dependent upon that. Instead, Lechmere, at the inquest, gave the name Charles Cross. His mother had earlier bigamously married a police constable called Thomas Cross, but he had died 19 years earlier. My supposition is that Robert Paul's newspaper story, placing Lechmere where the woman was, prompted Lechmere to come forward to control the narrative and divert any away from himself. Although Lechmere was not named, both Paul and Misen had a good look at him, and the last thing a guilty man would want was to be found unexpectedly in a police dragnet. Lechmere was not to know that the police had actually discounted Paul's story. Helson's statement was not published by the press until the 3rd of September, by which time Lechmere would have already presented himself. At any event, Lechmere totally changed the narrative. Henceforth, PC Neal was no longer the first finder. It was Charles Cross with Robert Paul. But Paul had yet to come forward to the authorities. As previously mentioned, on Friday the 8th of September 1888, Annie Chapman was murdered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman took place just 8 days apart. These murders were the closest together in terms of time of all the Whitechapel murders, aside from obviously the double event murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, which were about 45 minutes apart. The murder of Annie Chapman took place only about 100 yards away from Cobbett's Court. In his newspaper interview, Paul had only said they worked in the trade with Covent Garden. But at the inquest, Lechmere helpfully volunteered the information that Paul worked off Cobbett's Court. The next we hear of Paul was his attendance at the inquest when it reconvened on the 17th of September. Paul's final appearance in this case was when he gave yet another short but very interesting interview to Lloyd's weekly newspaper, which they published on the 30th of September 1888. Given his willingness to talk to Lloyd's yet again, presumably Paul had been happy with how they had covered his earlier interview. Mr. Paul says that after he made his statement to our representative, which appeared in Lloyd's, he was fetched up in the middle of the night by the police and was obliged to lose a day's work the next day, for which he got nothing. He was then summoned to give evidence at the inquest on 2 different days, and he had to pay a man 5 shillings each day to do his work, or he would have lost his place. Again, Paul expressed antagonism towards the police and indeed the whole process. The police had somehow found Paul at his house and taken him out in the middle of the night. The police must have had to search to find Paul's Foster Street house. All they had to go on was his name, and that Lechmere had told him that he had worked off Cobbett's Court. Walter Dew was a young detective constable based at H Division's Commercial Street Police Station in 1888. He went on to have a celebrated career in the police and famously caught the murderer Dr. Crippen. His memoirs were entitled, not surprisingly, I Caught Crippen, and included reminiscences from 1888. Time, age, and that Dew was in H Division, whereas the search for Paul would have been conducted by J Division, must be taken into account. But Dew remembered how Paul was regarded with reference to the meeting between Lechmere and Paul. The carman, Lechmere, had gone but a short distance when he saw another man, Paul, on the opposite side of the street, whose behaviour was certainly suspicious. The other man seemed to seek to avoid the carman. Then, with regard to the subsequent search for Paul, all this was afterwards told in evidence by the carman. It never had the corroboration of the other man. The police made repeated appeals for him to come forward, but he never did so. Why did he remain silent? Was it guilty knowledge that caused him to ignore the appeals of the police? In Dew's mistaken memory, Paul was never found. In actuality, of course, he was. But the significance is that clearly there was a search that H Division were aware of. So it must have taken up a reasonable amount of time, and Paul was regarded with suspicion. Paul stated in his Lloyd's interview that he had attended the inquest over the road there on 2 days. What were those 2 days? The inquest was held over 4 days in total. The first day was the 1st of September. It's impossible for Paul to have attended, as the police still believed that PC Neal was the first finder, a view the police stuck to until at least the evening of Sunday the 2nd of September. The second day was the 3rd of September, when Lechmere appeared, confirming Paul's story. It can only have been after this that the police could have started looking for Paul, as prior to this they disbelieved his story and would hardly have diverted resources looking for him. The third day was the 17th of September, which is certainly when Paul attended, as he testified, and the fourth and last day was the 22nd of September, when logically Paul must also have been compelled to attend. This makes sense, as Paul's final interview with Lloyd's appeared on the 30th of September. So when did the police give Paul the old late night knock on the door? All we can say for sure that it must have been between the 3rd of September and the 15th of September. But we can almost certainly narrow it down more from that. It's extremely unlikely that the police would have found Paul sooner than at best a couple of days, and Dew would hardly have remembered a search if it had been so swiftly conducted. So it would have been several days after the 3rd at the very least. It also seems unlikely that significant resources would have been devoted to finding Paul if he was just a reluctant witness who wouldn't add much to the testimony of Misen or Lechmere. In my view, the key reason why the police wanted to find Paul dragged him out of his house under arrest in the middle of the night, taken in for questioning to a police station. And make no mistake, if you are taken away, you're under arrest. Was that the murder of Annie Chapman happened on the 8th of September, just 100 yards or so away from where Lechmere last saw him at Cobbett's Court. That fits all the evidence we have and is by far the most likely course of events. And regular viewers will know that, in my opinion, Lechmere looked for a victim near Paul's workplace soon after the Polly Nichols murder to implicate Paul, to get some sort of revenge on Paul for compelling Lechmere to come forward when Paul gave his newspaper interview, and to misdirect the police investigation. This has been the story of Robert Paul and his singular importance in the Jack the Ripper case. A detailed examination of Robert Paul provides a clear indication of Lechmere's guilt. To recap, Paul is the witness who saw Lechmere standing alone by the freshly slain body of Mary Ann or Polly Nichols. How long Lechmere had been there we cannot tell, because Paul had not noticed him walking in front of him after he left his house in Foster Street, despite having multiple opportunities to do so. Paul had disturbed the killer in the act. Paul was marginally involved in the deception that Lechmere worked on PC Misen. Paul's newspaper interview almost certainly provoked Lechmere into coming forward and testifying at the inquest. And Annie Chapman's murder was tied in with Lechmere's desire to implicate Paul and misdirect the investigation. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, ring the notification bell, share, and of course, comment below on your thoughts.